This is chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby. It's the chapter in which everything comes to a head. All the stories which we've been meeting are tied together in this one chapter. Everything converges into one set of incidents. The setup is that there's been a change in circumstances. Instead of the parties, there's a Saturday night where people don't come. Cars come expectantly and then they turn sulkily away. A nice example of personification, since cars can be neither expectant nor sulky. They turn away, and when Nick goes to visit, suspecting that something might actually be wrong and that Gatsby is sick, he finds that all the servants are gone and they've been replaced by people who turn out to be associates of Wolfsheim's. So this means that the bootlegger, the man who fixed the World Series, is kind of there in Gatsby's house, and things are not looking quite as good as they were. Gatsby calls Nick and he wants to get Daisy to come over. Something was up, is the quote. And the next day we get an account of Nick coming. Remember, he works in New York. He's on the train, and you get a pretty detailed description of how very hot the whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. The straw seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while, and then as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, and on it goes. So we get a couple of paragraphs where he's describing this awful heat, and that's important. The importance of it is that heat makes people feel fractious. Everyone's feeling frayed, their tempers are short. So as always, the weather is a metaphor for what's happening in the story itself. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house, however, blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as we waited at the door. Jordan's inside. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch like silver idols weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. One of these marvellous images that Fitzgerald comes up. "We can't move," they say together, as if they're some sort of dolls. Then Gatsby stands in the centre of the crimson carpet and gazes around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed, her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. We have the cloud image around Daisy because of her celestial beauty. Jordan, being a gossip, whispers that Tom's girl is on the telephone. And we hear Tom having a conversation which seems to be with Wilson. We don't know if it really is or not, pretending that he's discussing selling a car. Then Tom flung open the door, blocked out its space for a moment with his thick body. Again, Tom is one of the people pretty well the only person, whose physical presence is hammered into us. He's thick. He's got a thick body. He puts out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. "I'm glad to see you." And then Daisy looks around doubtfully and says, "You know I love you," to Gatsby as they kiss. And then Daisy looks around doubtfully. It says, "You kissed Nick too." What a low, vulgar girl. It's a tease. "I don't care," cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch, just as a freshly laundered nurse leading a little girl came into the room. So we're 2/3 of the way through the book, and for the first time we're going to meet Tom and Daisy's child. "Blessed, precious," she crooned. "Come to your own mother that loves you." The child comes over. "Blessed and precious, stand up now, say howdy do." "Gatsby and I," says Nick, leaned down in turn, took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, Gatsby kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he'd ever really believed in her existence. So Nick is reminding us of the fantasy that that Daisy has been living. And then we have a little chat with the little girl, who is called Pammy, which we only discover about 1/3 of the way down the page. Everyone says goodbye to her. Gatsby takes up his drink, and we all drink in long, greedy swallows. Somebody says that the sun's getting hotter every year, and Tom invites Gatsby to come outside and have a look at the place. Nick goes with them out onto the veranda, and they look out to the sea and says, Gatsby says, "I'm right across from you." Tom says, "So you are." Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dog days along shore. Dog days are the end of summer. Slowly the white wings of the boat moved against the blue, cool limit of the sky. So again, we're getting this vivid pictorial image of Tom and Daisy's life being a little bit better than everybody else's. But then what'll we do with ourselves this afternoon, cried Daisy, and the day after that, and the next 30 years. So she's having a cynical moment. It's so hot, everything's so confused. Let's all go to town. So this is Daisy having a temper tantrum and being childish. Who wants to go to town? Daisy demanded insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Their eyes met. They stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. So the fact that these two are really connected is very obvious to everybody. And the fact that she told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy, as if he just recognised somebody he knew a long time ago. Tom has this flash of realisation that Daisy is in an intimate relationship or has an intimate connection. It's probably a sexual connection, but that's not entirely clear. You resemble... and he realises that his wife has actually got somebody else. All right, broke in Tom quickly. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on, we're all going into town. So he intervenes in order to regain control of the social setup. Come on, his temper cracked a little. What's the matter? His hand trembling with the effort at self-control. Remember how when he didn't control himself, he broke Myrtle's nose? Well, he's not about to do that in polite society, but you get the sense that his emotions are so strong that he would quite like to. So, let's have fun, begs Daisy. Come on. They went upstairs to get ready, while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. They chat, they make small talk, and then Tom says he's going inside to get whiskey, and Gatsby turns to Nick rigidly. I can't say anything in this house, old sport. She's got an indiscreet voice, I remarked. It's full of... And here we get the most famous quote in the whole book. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood it before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. That is a most important quote. Put a box around it, make sure that you've got it, because it grabs Daisy's character and Gatsby's impression of her. Then they have a bit of a to and fro about who's going to go in which car, and Tom says, well, you take my coupe and let me drive your car to town. This suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby and he tries to get out of it. Anyway, Tom was frowning with an indefinable expression, definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognisable, passed over Gatsby's face. Come on, Daisy, said Tom, pressing her with his hand toward Gatsby's car. I'll take you in this circus wagon. So Tom is disparaging Gatsby's car. We know that Gatsby's car is the height of sophistication. And he opens the door, but she moved out from the circle of his arm. You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow in the coupe. So Daisy gives her own husband the slip, which shows that Tom is not in control. She walks closer to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got in the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the other. There's a bit about the driving. So what Daisy does is engineer it so that she travels with Tom. But what you need to notice is the tension that builds as this manoeuvring takes place, and the way that Tom, having seen the way that they gazed at each other and were isolated in space, is unable to, or is very suspicious and is very angry about it. We then get a pretty detailed description of the drive, but they stop at Wilson's garage. Tom acts as though it's for gas, and when Wilson comes out, he says that he's sick. He says that he's all run down. With an effort, Wilson left the shade and the support of the doorway and, breathing hard, unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. What has really happened to Wilson is that he's realised that Myrtle is having an affair with somebody. They've had a huge row, and Myrtle is locked up inside in her room, inside the garage. And Wilson is physically ill, made physically sick by the discovery that his wife has been unsettled. Wilson says, I've been here too long, I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. Your wife does? Exclaimed Tom, startled. So Wilson's approach to discovering that his wife has been unfaithful is to say, we're just going to get out of here. And it's important that they're returning to the west, because as we know, the east is the scene of all the evil doing, and the west is the place where these things are able to be, where proper morals live. And Wilson is probably the only person in the entire book who has a decent sense of what is right and wrong. He says, I just got wised up to something funny in the last 2 days, and that's why I want to get away. That's why I've been bothering you about the car. But the relentless beating heat was beginning to confuse Nick, and he had a bad moment before he realises that so far his suspicions haven't alighted on Tom. So Nick seems to feel he has some sort of stake in this, some sort of role. He's got some kind of wants to be aware of where the levers are, because another way of looking at this is that, well, who cares? He's not that fond of Tom and Daisy. He does have a kind of fondness and an attachment to Gatsby, but really, I suppose Daisy's his second cousin. But the fact that he feels uneasy about it is quite interesting. It says that that locality, meaning the Valley of Ashes, was always vaguely disquieting. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg kept their vigil, but I perceived after a moment that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. And in one of the windows, Myrtle Wilson is peering down at the car. Myrtle Wilson's face was an expression that he'd often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realised that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom, but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. And as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot whips of panic. Lovely metaphor, the hot whips of panic. But also notice that we have Nick once again being superior. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, was slipping precipitately from his control. And we know that Tom likes to be in control. Jordan starts making small talk, and they talk about the heat in New York on summer afternoons. And she says there's something very sensuous about it, overripe, as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall in your hands. This use of the word sensuous further upsets Tom. And then they start talking about where they're going to go and what they're going to do. But all they do is complain and say that it's hot. Tom and Daisy say, we'll just ride around and we'll meet you afterwards. We'll meet you on a corner. And she makes a joke. Tom says impatiently that they can't argue about it here and tells them to follow to the south side of Central Park in front of the Plaza. The Plaza Hotel is, of course, an extremely glamorous place. And what he's trying to do, keeping an eye on them, he keeps turning his head back to make sure that they're there, is to get them into the Plaza Hotel. And we're going to leave it there, and we're going to take up part 2 in a moment.